know people are still filtering in, but that's okay. I have a little patter to do first up. So thank you for being here. I just want to make note of what is actually really special about this event, which I didn't even mention to you, is that coincidentally, a year ago today, Kristin and I did an event at the Seagramstrom Center in Costa Mesa. And it was in the middle. It was a record-breaking storm had blown through Southern California. We actually considered canceling because we thought who would show up, but we didn't cancel and we did show up, and about 1,400 other people showed up. And to me, this was the night before this book was published, and that, I will say that night kind of gave me the first inkling of what you were about to experience for this whole year. So here we are, literally exactly a year later.
Wow.
And it's done, shall we say, well?
I guess.
And yeah, let's give her, seriously.
I'll clap for that one, thank you.
Thank you. As far as I know, it has not skipped a week on the bestseller list since it's been out. But I know you, and for those of you who don't know me and how we're connected, I'm actually Kristin's audiobook narrator. I recorded this book, but also The Four Winds and The Great Alone. Okay, thank you. So I know her, and I'm privileged to call her a friend as well. And I know that that type of success as a metric doesn't actually mean that much to you. It's lovely and it's nice, but I want to start by asking the kind of bold question of how are you defining or feeling the success of this book after a year? What's the most important part of that success to you?
Okay, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I've been doing this now, I think 30 years, and I'm an overnight success, which is so great. Very, very happy about that.
So easy. They just handed you the keys to publishing.
But the most important thing about this book, because we've talked about this before, and again, it was in Costa Mesa. We did this huge room, and talking about this book that no one had read yet, and we did a Q&A, and 3 women came to the podium and said, "We are nurses from Vietnam." And the entire 1,400 people gave them a standing ovation.
Sobbing.
I think everyone was crying. And that was the beginning to me of what's the most important part about this book. It's the conversations that it is starting. And I think these conversations are long overdue. I'm hearing from, children, adult children who are asking their dads about Vietnam for the first time, their moms about Vietnam, people asking each other. And so that's the most important part of the success. And I am just sort of completely pretending that I never have to write another book, that I'm done. That's it.
You really don't if you didn't want to. you kind of, which I think is what is so, to people in the publishing community, especially other writers, what feels so good about your success. And it's not just the women. I mean, to be fair, the last 3 books, but even before that really were a turning point for you. But I think there is something really inspiring about a lifer such as yourself having this recognition, and you have had so many publishing ups and downs, and you have just stayed true to what you wanted to do. You have challenged yourself as a writer, and so this kind of success feels like one of our own. It happened for one of our own, and it's a really, really
It's true,
gratifying.
because it always seems like the big books of the year are a debut.
Right.
And,
because it's true, they get the debuts often will get the most of the money and the push because that's like you're fresh and you're it's something new for people and they're excited. But it's hard to put in how many books now?
Like 25. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know what? I think in terms of just because people always ask me about they want to be a writer or you want to be anything, you want to do anything in life. And the answer is really keep showing up and keep doing the thing you love and do it over and over and over. And you will get better just by, sheer time spent. And I think that's the important message, because you're right, it doesn't happen for authors like me very often, and even less for female authors like me. Because, you know, women's books are often put in a section, and so to find a book like The Women that men and women are reading, that young people are reading, old people are reading, you know, and it's really inspiring for a lot of people.
In that vein, did you, first of all, how many people have actually read the book or listened to the, oh, okay.
Okay.
That's what we're talking about. You write about this in the author's note a little bit, but I think it's worth kind of fleshing out more. You first conceived of this novel in '97, but you didn't write it, and I want you to explain why at that time. But I also, what was the original seed? What was the germ of that idea? Was it specifically nurses, or did you just say, I want to write about Vietnam? Like, what was the thing that popped into your head?
So I was a child during the Vietnam War, and it was obviously a very tumultuous time. Even, you know, as a third and fourth and fifth grader, I felt that. And my best friend's dad was a fighter pilot in Vietnam, and he was shot down and was missing. And as I talk about in the book, we wore those bracelets. I'm sure there are people in this room who wore those bracelets. And so for like 15 years, I had his name and the date that he was shot down on my wrist. And then as the vets started coming home, a lot of them were my friends' dads. And so I saw how they were treated. And as a child, it just made this huge impact on me. I wasn't exactly sure what I had to say about it, but I knew that it was something that was important to sort of look back on. And so I pitched a Vietnam-era book to my editor in 1997, which means that I was 37 years old. And she had been at Berkeley in 1968, my editor. And she basically said, Kristin, I love you. You're not old enough and you're not good enough. And nobody wants to read about Vietnam. And she's a smart lady, and I listened to her. And so, but I kept this idea. I wanted to write about Vietnam. There's a little bit of, you know, it in The Great Alone, I kind of touched on it. But so every couple of years I would look back and I would think, am I good enough yet? Am I old enough yet? And the answer was always no. The answer was always, okay, now I know why she didn't want me to take on this topic. It's huge, and it's divisive. And so it wasn't until March of 2020, where we in Seattle were in lockdown. I had just turned in, you know, my Great Depression book during the pandemic, and I was looking for something to do, you know, something to write. And like everybody else, I was watching how divided our country was and the anger that was going on in the beginning of the pandemic. And it felt very Vietnam-era-esque. And then I saw the nurses, and I saw the nurses and the doctors who were on the front line, and, you know, heard the stories about what they were dealing with. And that's when I went, okay, I don't care if anybody's ready. I don't care if anyone wants to read this. I'm going to write about the nurses who served in Vietnam. And the minute I started doing the research on these women who were remarkable, I knew that there was no turning back.
At what point did you begin to sense, I mean, I understand the initial fear that maybe people still weren't ready for this, but at what point did you start to think, okay, maybe I have tapped a vein here, or this is going to connect with people. It's giving people permission to talk about this thing that we just do not talk about. Like, was it writing, was it editing, or was it not even until publication?
You know, it wasn't until, okay, I'll tell you exactly when it was. So the book took 3 years. There's a year of research. There's a year of writing the wrong book, which is kind of a bummer. And then there's a year of writing the book as you read it, right? And And as I was working on it, I kept thinking, these women are so amazing. But there were a lot of touchy parts. I mean, I knew it was violent, it was gritty, it was relentless, it was a lot of adjectives. And it wasn't until the book was done, and one of the women who was kind of my mentor during this, Diane Carlson Evans, who wrote a book called Healing Wounds about her experiences as an Army nurse in Vietnam. She's an amazing woman, the founder of the Vietnam Women's Memorial. And so she came home from her service and had a lot of the same issues that all the vets had. And she channeled this into a 10-year fight to create the Women's Vietnam Memorial. And because, remembrance matters. And of course, it was a very difficult road. They tried to have her put it in Akron, Ohio at a children's park. It was a very difficult thing. And so she invited me to the 30th anniversary of the memorial in Washington, D.C. And so to stand there, and I met all these nurses, they'd come back together again for the first time in decades, and to see them laughing and talking and crying and telling their stories and sharing their experiences. Their kids were there, their husbands were there. And one of the nurses who had read an advance copy of the book, unbeknownst to me, came up to me and said, "This book is going to start healing us." And that's when I thought, oh. I really had not, I hadn't seen it in that light before.
That's so interesting. And I feel like here we are. I think a lot of people feel that way about, as you said, it's opening up conversations between generations. So you actually, as a writer, bounce around between many different historical time periods. So you hadn't, in your previous books, you had never touched this time period, and you had to do research, but you also had, I think for the first time, well, no, maybe with Great Alone, you had some living memory of the time period yourself.
Yeah, it was so interesting when The Great Alone came out, which was set, I think, like 70s, early 70s. They called it a historical novel. And I thought, in my lifetime? Really? I don't think this is a historical novel. But now, of course, I realize that it is. So I've touched a bit on the 60s and 70s because they're great time periods, But this was the first time I was going to be writing a novel, a historical novel, that I knew people who had lived through it and experienced what my characters experienced were going to be reading it. And that was pretty terrifying.
It also covers so much time. I wrote this down because it tackles the era from May 1966 to November 13th, 1982, which isn't maybe that long chronologically, but it feels like many different eras because so much change happened at that time.
Yeah.
So how much were you relying on your own memory of certain things and then looking back at the research?
Well, my memory in like the 60s and the early 70s, what you can see of my life is the music. That's it. The music and the fashions is really what I remembered. And so that was really fun to, bring that in. But the depth of it, the meat of it, was over my head. So I had to go back in. I knew what had happened because of it, but to actually see the points of change, between the 60s and the 70s and what it was like to leave, the U.S. in 67 and come home in 69 and the difference in the world in those 2 years. That was all research and help. I had help.
Do you have something surprising in your research that came out that you weren't expecting, or something that just, like, what stays with you when you think back on that research period?
Well, there's a couple of things. The thing that was most surprising to me was I kept reading, like in the memoirs, the nurses' memoirs, there kept being this sentence, there were no women in Vietnam. And these nurses were being told over and over by the VA, by fellow Vietnam vets. All of these people were saying there were no women in Vietnam. And I didn't want to put that sentence in the book because I thought that simply cannot be true. It cannot be true. Florence Nightingale, we know that there were nurses in World War II, right? MASH was the most, successful show on the air. And I was thinking, how could these women have heard this over and over again? And so when I was at the memorial, I asked, and they, so many of them said, yeah, that was said to me. And in fact, I did a Zoom, a couple, I don't know, I lose track of time, but not too long ago, with one of the veterans of America, Vietnam veterans of America. And he relayed this story to me where they had just started this organization. It was like 1982, I think. And they had sent out, all the word and invited all the vets to join them, right? And done it through all official channels. And there was a knock at his door, and this woman, Linda Van Devanter, who was a nurse who wrote a memoir called Home Before Morning, which is fabulous, opened the door, and he said, I looked at her and I thought, we forgot the women. I'm so sorry. And so even the vets, even the Vietnam veterans, group had forgotten the women contemporaneously.
This is actually, I was going to wait and maybe do a reading at the end, but because of the section you just brought up, this is the section I want to read from the book. And I always, I was like, do you want to read? And she's like, why would I want to read?
I'm going to read next to Julia.
Yeah.
That's really fun.
So, because this, I think, a year and a half since I recorded this book, I think about this book a lot, but this is the scene I keep coming back to because I just, everything, to your point, what they were being told is amazing. So this is when Frankie goes to the VA Medical Center because she has heard that there are groups there and there's help there. Inside, she went to the front desk, where a large woman in a floral-patterned polyester dress sat in front of an IBM Selectric, her scarlet nails clacking on the keys. Ma'am, Frankie said. The receptionist paused in her typing, but didn't move her hands away from the keyboard, then looked up. You in trouble, darling? Is your husband angry? Apparently, the sunglasses weren't much of a camouflage. I've heard that you offer therapy for Vietnam vets. There's a rap session at 10. Why? Where is it? The woman frowned, pulled a pencil out of her big hair, tapped it on the desk. Down that hall, second door to the left, but it's only for Vietnam vets. Thanks. Frankie walked down the hall, past several men sitting on molded plastic chairs. At room 107, she saw a flyer taped to the textured frosted glass panel in the top half of the door. Vietnam veterans, share your stories with each other. Rapping helps. She took a seat, waiting, staring at the clock. Her whole body ached and her head hurt and she felt sick to her stomach, but she didn't move. Her left wrist throbbed. She looked down, saw a bruise blooming on her pale skin. The door in front of her opened at 9:55. A few men walked into the room. She paused, tried to calm herself, and then she got up, opened the door onto a small windowless room in which folding chairs had been set up in a circle. Several of the chairs were occupied by men, most of them Frankie's age or younger, with long, untended hair, big sideburns, and mustaches. A few older, grizzled-looking guys sat with crossed arms. More men stood over by a table, eating donuts and pouring coffee from a tall silver urn. Frankie had expected to be the only woman, but she still felt uncomfortable as one by one the men turned to look at her. A man approached her. He wore a checkered shirt and cowboy jeans held up by a huge buckled belt. His long layered hair flipped back from a center part. A huge mustache covered most of his upper lip. Can I help you, foxy lady? He said, smiling. I'm here for the Vietnam Veterans Rap Therapy Group. Well, it's groovy that you want to understand your man, but this is for veterans only. I am a vet. Of Vietnam. I am a Vietnam vet. Oh, there were no women in Nam. Wrong. ANC nurse, 2 tours, the 36th and 71st evac hospitals. If you never saw a woman, you were lucky. It meant you didn't end up in a hospital.
He frowned. Oh, well, you should talk to the other chicks about whatever. I mean, you didn't see combat. The men would clam up with a woman in the room. Are you telling me I can't stay? I have nightmares and I'm scared. You won't help me? You don't belong here, ma'am. This is for vets who saw action in Nam.
So as you said, this is a sprawling story. And where do you start and how do you select what you want to write about? So let's talk about the writing of it. The novel is broken into two parts. Part one covers Frankie's origin story, her time in Vietnam, and her mostly disastrous initial return home. And then part two picks up 2 years later, in 1971, with the nascent anti-war movement, which brings everything Frankie has tried to suppress back to the surface. How did you decide that you were going to, was it as important for you to cover the return as it was to cover the war? And did you know that going in to the writing process?
Like I said, I wrote the wrong book first, so I wrote a different version of it. However, within that, the Vietnam section was always the Vietnam section. I mean, that was always the heart of this book. And the difficult part for the author in me was you've got this 200 pages that is literally life and death every moment. The stakes are high, people are dying, women are being, pushed to their breaking point every moment, right? Well, I still have another 200 pages. Unless I want this entire book to be the war, I have to bring her home, right? And it was really difficult to try to figure out what was as important in the coming home as the war had been. And I really tried not to do, honestly, I tried not to do PTSD. I tried not to do addiction and some of the things that Frankie goes through. But when the chips were down, that's just where the research led me. And that was really the story that, I needed to tell. And it was actually, it was more difficult as a writer to put her through that half of the book than to put her through the first half of the book. Because as bad as the first half was, it was about Frankie's empowerment, about Frankie growing up. It was about girlfriends. It was about, things that mean a lot to me. And the second half of the book was really about falling apart and hitting rock bottom and sort of realizing that this strong, courageous, heroic woman had been destroyed in some way and had to put herself back together. But of course, her friends helped.
Speaking of her friends, so how did you come to Barb and Ethel? Because they're so beautifully representative of the different people who were in that war. I mean, we have, Barb is from segregated Georgia, has a Black Panther brother, has a lot of feelings, very valid about who exactly, for the most part, was doing the fighting and dying in that war. And then you have Ethel, who is a white farmer's daughter from Virginia, who'd followed her sweetheart to Vietnam and lost him there. Mm-hmm. And they could not really, the three of them could not be from more different places and perspectives. But through them, you give us such a holistic overview of the type of women that were there. Was that intentional? Were there other characters that got cut? Like, how did you come to these being the women?
It was ultimately intentional. What happened, it was really interesting because, like I said, this was a lot of research. And the way that I was able to tell myself that I had the capacity to do this was to do it through one woman. I thought, I can tell you one woman's experience, right? But as I began writing that and as I was sort of understanding the book and what was happening, I began to understand, okay, my job is not just to give you this one woman's story, it's to give you a universal woman's story through this one woman. And so that was really what I was focused on. What is Frankie doing? Where is she going? Who is she interacting with? And it never even occurred to me that this was going to be a book about friendship, which is, I think, actually what the book is about. What happened was I'm writing along, well, I write longhand, so I'm writing along. I do. And
Did someone else transcribe it for you?
uh-huh.
Okay, thank God. Okay.
Now.
Yeah.
And so I'm writing along, and it's the scene, for those of you who have read it, the scene where she lands in Vietnam, having worn her uniform with her girdle and her heels, on this jet, and then she lands and everything's a mess. And she, gets put in this little room, and then they fly her out to the hospital, and she has to go into her hooch, her little shed, I guess, right? And I thought, well, there have to be women in there. She's not by herself, right?
She didn't get single.
Yeah, exactly. And so I just thought, okay, well, I need 2 roommates. And as I do when I'm writing, I just create Barb and Ethel. I wouldn't have named her Ethel if I'd have known she was going to be so important, I think. I don't know. But they then took over, and I think it's that thing where we're used to seeing male camaraderie in war. And so it was really fun to dig into female friendship under fire and to see how these women continued to support each other throughout the rest of their lives, because, as you point out, I don't think they would have ever met otherwise or been friends. And then once I started developing them, that's when I realized, okay, I have a chance to show a broader scope of the women who were there by these 2 characters, and to show what was going on back at home as well, because, when you only have the 1 character, that's why I had the letters coming from her mother, to try to show as a bigger story with a singular focus.
It's beautifully done. Something that I think the novel does really well that I haven't seen talked about a lot, so I'm going to talk about it, is you're testing our kind of preconceived notions of morality, and through the lens of Frankie, that Frankie has a lot of her own issues around what is moral, what is immoral, and we see her go from a young woman of the 60s to a woman of the 70s, and that was not necessarily an easy transition. And there are many times in the book when Frankie's morality is challenged, and sometimes she'll make a moral decision that we as readers disagree with, and sometimes she will make an immoral decision that we as readers completely understand, given what she has just survived. And I think you do a beautiful job. We've talked about before how there's a burden on female main characters to be likable in fiction, and we've talked about how maybe the better way to think of that is understandable. And you do a beautiful job of tying in that war itself is fraught with questions of morality. And that kind of becomes embedded in Frankie, where she is constantly testing her own morality. And I wanted to ask how much that was a part of her character to you, is that be the good girl, do the right thing. How much of that was innate in her, and how much of that was imposed on her?
Well, I mean, I very consciously chose to create a character from a fairly affluent background, a religious background, and, a woman who is the child of the greatest generation parents who were very pro-patriotic and had, a lot of family stories about World War II. And to throw her in, because this woman, she's 21 years old, fresh out of nursing school, been in Catholic schools her whole life, doesn't have a lot of worldly experience, and then is thrown into the war to try to navigate. At the same time, she's coming of age as a woman. And so it was important to me specifically that she have a really strong moral core, and that she sticks with that. We see that with the character of Jamie, where she really believes that it's important to do the right thing, it's important to be moral, it's important to be a stand-up kind of person. And that actually I don't want to do any spoilers because there was one or two hands not up. But what breaks Frankie in the end and what brings her to her knees is not her PTSD, it's not even her addiction, it is making a choice that she knows is immoral. And that's when, she is broken. And so that was a very conscious arc for her to get to that point, because one of the things, as you point out, that really bothers me in general, in fiction, and frankly in life, women are not afforded a full range of choices in their life to be sympathetic. It's so important that we are likable, that we agree. And so it was important for Frankie to be able to be a full and flawed human being.
And I think you did it to the extent that I was surprised. I mean, I had written this question a year ago, and I've been surprised since then that I have not seen, granted I don't live on Goodreads, but I have not seen pushback to the decision.
Oh, it's there.
Oh, okay, well, I really wanted the win.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
In fact, there's a lot of pushback too on how can I call a book The Women when it's about one woman? So.
Well, people don't
There you
read.
go. They don't say this to me directly.
I was gonna say, I was like, they shouldn't say it to me directly either, because I will throw down. Okay. Do you have a favorite character in the book?
Frankie. I mean, Frankie is
Is she your favorite
probably my
character?
favorite character of all time. I mean, I would say I have 3 or 4 others. I liked
Elsa's in there,
Vion.
right?
No, not Elsa.
Really?
Yeah, I like Elsa. I like her. No, it would be Vion from The Nightingale, Frankie from here. There is a 6-year-old feral child in Magic Hour who stays with me. Every once in a while I think, I wonder what she's doing.
Sequel.
She's now 40.
Yeah,
So.
that could be fun. I would like to spend the next just 10 minutes talking about where you're at this point, what you are working on. Where I would never ask you to divulge what exactly the content is of what you were working on, but you are putting pen to paper at the moment.
I am working, I am writing. It's been interesting this last year. I've been sort of thrown off because having done this for 30 years, 25 novels, and frankly, The Nightingale was pretty successful.
Yeah.
And so I should have been ready for what it took to be out in a world with the women. And I just haven't been. It's a lot. There's a lot of things I have to do, social media, which I know nothing about, and
She's
so
underselling herself. She's very good at it.
I'm not.
You really are.
And I don't have an assistant, so it's just been a lot of work. So that's my way of saying, in case you're in cahoots with my publisher, I am working, but it's not going very well.
I will be reporting back.
Thank you. Many people are asking.
Yeah.
And I will say, interestingly enough, something I've sort of learned over time, I don't think we've talked about this either. So I learned in retrospect that I sort of need to reinvent myself every 7 to 8 years. And so I started, in historical romance, and I did that for about 6 years. And then I thought, need something else. So then I moved into what was then called women's fiction, hardcover women's fiction. I did that for 7 years. They were still kind of more love stories, but they were about women finding their voice and, finding their passion. And women dealing with the things that I was dealing with then, marriage, working, babies, friends, all of that. And then exactly 7 years later, I got tired of that. And so I wrote Firefly Lane, book about friendship. And so I did that for a while. 7 years later, I wrote The Nightingale, first historical fiction novel, and it's been 9 years. So I'm just saying,
Wow.
I'm not telling you what's coming, but it's not what I've done before.
Aliens.
I want to do that so much.
Well, I will. So we're gonna end with, I do this like rapid fast 5 questions for authors when I do it. But your answer the last time sent like chills through a room because we suddenly got like we might have.
What did I say?
I'll get there.
Oh.
So anything on movie stuff? For any, I mean, everything, and everyone is always like, where's the movie? And it's like, please understand, from the Hollywood perspective, the last 5 years have been brutal.
That's
between COVID, between the strikes, now the fires, literally the people who make the stuff lost their home. Like, it's just been one smack down after the other. So things get delayed.
That being said, yeah, so The Nightingale has been in development for about 11 years. Fortunately, I mean, you know, people keep aging out, so there's that. We've got a good crew. We've got a beautiful screenplay by Dana Stevens, and we were 3 days from starting filming in March of 20. So shut down for COVID, and that was 2 years. And then, you know, we lost our director because of that, and then we came back, and then it was a strike, and then it was the strike. So hopefully, you know, this is the year. The Women, however, is really on a fast track with Warner Brothers. We have a fabulous writer. I don't think I'm allowed to say who it is yet, but really exciting screenwriter. So, and it's a strong team of women too, which is cool.
And also as it should be, also in your publishing timeline right now, do you know when paperback is happening, roughly? Okay. I mean, people are still buying.
That's right. Yeah.
Stop buying the hardcover, they'll give you the paperback. Kidding, don't do that. But you have a 10th anniversary of The Nightingale.
I do. Yeah, does anyone have one? Oh, she's got one right here. Oh, yay!
Turn it around. Yay.
Yeah, these are the first I've seen in the wild. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Here, yeah, look at this. So this is the new big thing, sprayed edges. Did I even know what this was? No, but they have all this beautiful, so anyway, very
So
pretty.
So pretty. Okay, so to wrap this up, what do you hope at this point, now that the book has been out in the world, and as we've said, it's been a juggernaut, as it just becomes a book on the shelf? Because eventually that does happen. And hopefully you don't have to be promoting it all the time anymore. What do you hope someone who would pick up the book in 10 years in a library, what do you hope they'll take away from it?
Oh, gosh, Julia, a new question.
So sorry.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, before, you know, early in my career, I never would have imagined that my books would still be on the shelf 10 years from now. Now I do hope that. And I do hope that, that what The Women does is open the door to a broader range of women's stories and of Vietnam era stories. And I suspect that it will, so get ready for that. Because I think now, there's been a lot of people like me who've been wanting to write it. And they were being told by their editors, nobody wants to read Vietnam. And so hopefully, because I think there's so many parallels between then and now, I think it's important. And I know that like when The Nightingale came out, you know, then what I heard then was, well, no one wants to read about women in World War II. And I was unaware of many books out there that were on that subject. And there have probably been 6,200 of them since, you know, in these last 10 years. And they're amazing. And so I do hope that, anytime a book about women breaks through, I hope that it, encourages a lot more in that vein.
Yeah. Was there a piece of the story that you had to just let go? You didn't have room for, it would have taken too long to do it right, like to give it the space that it needed. Is there something?
In the women?
Yeah.
Have you seen the book? Everything I wanted is in it. It's like huge.
I mean, you couldn't have done anything else to Frankie,
No.
but
Yeah, I really, really wanted to include the Vietnam Women's Memorial. I really wanted to, but that was another 10 years. And I just wanted Frankie to be better by then.
yeah, yeah. Okay, we're going to do this fast five here. You're good at this.
I'm not.
You really are. Think of it like you have you're writing, recommendations for people.
Okay.
That's really what it
All
is.
right.
Okay. What is the book that made you a reader?
Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. This is the one everyone goes, what?
Okay, but let me just say very quickly, I think that my geek girl years, the sci-fi, fantasy, horror, which is like my jam, is what has made me the world-building author that I am. And I think that's one of the things people feel in my books. I really immerse you in a world. I know, I was thinking I could have edited that. Anyway, but yeah, I think it's a big part of it.
No, there are still images from the Four Winds that live in my head of like when the wind
The
is
centipedes?
the centipedes
Yeah.
coming out of the walls, like that kind of. I was like, maybe she is a horror writer. So I think that's a fair point. It's like
Yes.
you build a very fully realized world, even down to the costumes, the
Yeah.
wardrobe, the actress here, but down to the clothing even,
Yeah.
you know how to paint the picture of the world. What's your favorite book?
Of mine? Or of anyone?
Both.
A favorite? Okay.
I just never ask authors their favorite because I always feel like you're asking favorite child, but you asked
no,
yourself.
No. I've got favorites and ones I don't like. Yeah. You can't do 25 and they're all gems, let's face it.
Yeah.
Well, okay, Lord of the Rings. I'm going to say for you guys, Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. If anyone hasn't read that, it is just a remarkable historical fiction.
Okay. What's a book that you think about often that like lives rent-free in your head? Not necessarily your favorite book, not necessarily the best book, but just something that you find yourself thinking about more than you maybe expected.
Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
I'm telling you. Okay, I'll pick another one. I like Dune. I get fear as the mind killer comes to me a lot as sort of advice from the great beyond.
This is what made us start to. This is how you ended up saying, I don't know, maybe I'll write a fantasy trilogy next, and we were like,
it's out there.
so exciting. What are you reading now?
I'm reading the new Isabel Allende,
Ooh.
which I wish I could remember the date. I think it's coming out in maybe June. Fabulous. She's remarkable.
This summer, by the way, the books that are coming up this summer are just.
Are they?
I mean, I feel like it's just one hit after, at least based on my recording schedule, it is. What book do you wish you'd written? Lord of the Rings.
No, I actually would have edited Lord of the Rings. It's a little long even for me. What book do I wish I had written? Pat Conroy, Prince of Tides.
Yes. Great. That concludes our event. Thank you all so much for coming out.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.